This is Parenting for the Everyday, a podcast dedicated to meeting parents in the trenches of parenthood. We explore how our faith fits into our parenting. With the help of our guests, we are seeking practical tips on how the gospel can speak into our day-to-day parenting. From the easy stuff to the hard stuff, we want to talk about it all.
Welcome to Parenting for the Everyday. I'm Holly Dyke-Andrew.
And I'm Becca Alvarez.
A few weeks ago, we did an episode on realistic quiet times. And a conversation that we kept having coming out of that was this idea of letting go of this perfectly bow-wrapped faith. And we've kind of come back to it a couple of times and talked about how do we talk about it on this podcast in this space, and kind of landed on me walking through maybe my infertility journey, because I feel like that's really when my bow-shaped faith really unraveled. And so I'm excited to kind of get to share that journey here in this space and kind of walk through what God taught me and how he molded me and just all the things that came through infertility and through loss.
And before we even get started, I just want to take a minute and thank you for being willing to talk about this. I know that this is something that is near and dear to your heart and a tender part of your life that maybe not many people even know about. I also think this is a little bit of an interesting topic to be talking about this time of year, but I felt really passionate about bringing it into a Christmas time because I think that Christmas can be something that is so exciting and wonderful, but the truth is that not everyone's lives are in a season of excitement and wonder, and it can feel really lonely when you're in that season and no one's really giving you space to be where you are. And I also really feel like it would take a dimension away from Christmas if we left that out, in the sense that even Mary and Joseph were in a really lonely time. And the end of that story ends well. We know it ends well. But in the middle, when you're getting shut out of every place and you are 9 months pregnant and about to have a baby, like, you are so lonely and you are such an outcast, and it looks so different than you thought it would look. And that's really the basis of where we want to start this episode.
Yeah. It's funny because some people know the story because I have shared it, and then it's been a while. So I think a lot of people don't necessarily know the road that I've walked to, but my journey to parenthood was anything but straight. It's a lot of curves, a lot of windy roads. My husband and I were diagnosed with unexplained infertility, which is the most unhelpful diagnosis you can receive.
Sounds unhelpful.
It's just no answers. Yeah. And so you're like, what do I do with this? Later, we would find out that there is a genetic abnormality, but that plays into it. But it has been decades of infertility and miscarriages. And I have had 8 miscarriages, which I always hesitate to say that number because everyone always is like, oh. And I'm only saying it because I just want to set the stage of hey, this was really hard. And for me, it came in the form of infertility and miscarriage. But for other people, loss comes in different. And you don't need to have 8 miscarriages to feel the depth of a miscarriage or a loss or infertility. And so just setting the stage that loss is really hard in whatever form that kind of looks like. And the biggest thing is that I feel like I grew up in church in a Christian home, and somehow along the way, I had this notion in my head of what a good Christian woman should look like. And at its core, it's this belief that she doesn't waver. That she's strong. She probably makes a good casserole. I don't know. I still can't do that.
Definitely sourdough.
Yes,
sure.
Nowadays, and I don't even know what is a starter. I don't even know.
I don't know.
But yeah, and it's only through the journey of infertility and loss that I came to realize how absolutely ridiculous and contrary to what the gospel says that notion is. And so, we can dive into it.
Let's dive. So starting kind of at the top, and you talked about having infertility impact your faith. How did it impact your faith?
Yeah, infertility and loss, I keep using those together, but I might just say infertility, but I mean loss in there as well. I feel like I could talk about it all day long, and I could never be able to fully summarize what it does to the depths of a woman's soul. It rocks every part of you. And it really wasn't long into my journey that I started to recognize that my head and my heart didn't say the same thing. And so I knew in my head that I should be saying, God is good, God is faithful, God has a plan, I trust his plan, he has his best for me. But what my heart was saying is, sure, God's good, but he's not good to me. And what I felt was forgotten, scared, unseen, alone. And there started to be this lie that would creep in that if God really loved me, I wouldn't be here. You know, if he loves you, how could he let you go through all of this loss and heartbreak? And what makes it more complicated is what I said earlier, right? It's this idea that like Christians should have a faith that weathers the storm and can stand in the midst of that. And when I didn't, on the outside, I'm saying all the right things, but on the inside, I'm not feeling these things. So then you add this layer of guilt that started to creep in of, man, you're a phony. You're a fake. You don't have a real faith. As what kind of Christian are you that as soon as it gets tough, you fall apart and you've got questions and you're doubting God's faithfulness to you. And so then on top of the loss and pain, you've got this guilt and shame that the enemy just weaves into a mess.
And isolation, I would assume, because especially if you're presenting one way and feeling it another way, you can only do that for so long before you just start to not show up anymore.
Yep.
Whew. How do you reconcile the belief in a loving God with the pain and loss associated with miscarriage and infertility?
Yeah. I think this is a really hard question.
This is a really hard question.
And there's probably not an answer that you leave with being like, oh, that's
perfect.
Good. I feel good about that. That makes total sense. But I can tell you what I walked through. And for me, at some point I realized that I associated God's love and goodness with two pink lines. And so without those lines, I believed the lie that God was withholding good from me. And it's that is such dangerous thinking. I think that's the seed that the enemy plants in so many of us. And for me, it's two pink lines, but it could be anything. It could be a job. It could be sickness. It could be wealth, a marriage, wealth. It could be your kids being successful. But all of a sudden, you've got that doubt that God's withholding on you. And so what happens is you start to look at God through the lens of your circumstances. And what you have to get to a place is you have to filter your circumstances through God. And so it's that making getting right side up again. I think that is the journey. And so at some point I had to accept the truth that not having kids, back in those days. And even now, like I've dealt with secondary infertility. I would love to have more kids, but the answer is no. The Lord has said no. And so I have to recognize that no is actually from God in his complete goodness. And that I say that really with fluidity, but it's really, really hard to do. And what happened in me is that it revealed, I don't want to say the crack in my faith, but it revealed this deficit in the fact that the brokenness and despair that resulted out of my pain wasn't a result of my circumstances. It was a result of a detachment from God and who he was. And so because I didn't have a clear view on who God was and what the gospel meant for me, that created that level of brokenness from him, not my infertility. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. I want to clarify too. So you are saying that it wasn't, your brokenness was felt to the depth that it was felt.
I mean, the pain is still real.
The pain is still real.
Just because you're really tethered to God doesn't mean you don't feel pain.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was not the infertility itself.
I mean, I would say like the depth of the brokenness that I felt was a result of being detached from who God really is. Because the pain, if I'm attached to who God is and I have a clear event, like if what I believe about the gospel is true, right? That at my worst and most unlovable self, God sends Jesus to pay the price, then that means, and he's working to restore all things, then he is good.
Yeah.
That proves that he's good.
Yeah.
So how could I reduce God's goodness to my earthly circumstance? So when I lose sight of God's goodness, it's not because of my circumstances, it's because I've lost sight of God.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Okay.
How did you get there?
Oh man, I didn't.
Is that something that like one day you're feeling this way and the next day you remember God's goodness?
Oh no. It's such a process.
How do you process to there?
It's funny. I remember being in the shower I do a lot of good thinking in the shower.
Shower's a good place to
processing,
think.
praying. And I remember kind of being like really, really angry. And at that point, I was kind of letting God have it.
Yeah.
Like I was kind of like, this is ridiculous. You've put this desire in my heart. And then you say no to it. This is stupid. Why would you do that? And I really heard God speak to the depth of my heart so clearly. And he said, Holly, you don't trust me to give you what you want. Because at this point, I had actually really stopped praying about it, because we can get into that later. But so he was like, you don't trust me to give you what you want, but you don't trust me to take care of you if I don't. And so it was like, oh, okay. Yeah. It's like you had to wrestle. I really had to wrestle with that for a long time and come to the kind of the understanding that, did I just want God to give me what I was asking for? Is that what I really wanted? Or is it possible to find satisfaction that when God does not fix the difficulty in my life, but he instead gives me grace to endure them without becoming bitter, without becoming resentful, that is his goodness? Nancy Guthrie has a quote where she says, "Can I move from desperately seeking relief to diligently seeking to glorify God as I treasure him more than I do my own comfort?" And again, that's really hard, and it's not a yes. And it's I would say it is a lifelong surrender to get to that point. And it's not something that I could ever do on my own. And so to answer your question, no. It was through his strength, his grace, in my weakness, that he becomes the only place where all of a sudden it's the only way that I can place my hope. It's the only place that makes sense, when you start to really let him fill in the gaps, of all your wrong thinking.
You mentioned that at some point during this journey, 10 years, that it was just something that you stopped praying about.
Yeah.
So what did that role look like? Maybe even take us through not the whole timeline, but the timeline from the beginning of kind of what prayer and scripture looked like in a time of needing to cope during your disappointment and loss, and what it looked like towards the end.
Yeah. I stopped praying because at some point you get to the point where, at least for me, it is better to not ask, so you don't have to be told no over and over again, right? And so it was like a defense mechanism that I was, unhealthily coping with. If you are struggling with infertility, Sarah Haggerty has a book called Every Bitter Thing is Sweet, and I highly recommend the book. And she talks about how she meets a woman who is saying finds out that Sarah is struggling with infertility, and she says, "Oh my gosh, I've been there. It took us 2 months to get pregnant, and that was really hard. And so I totally understand what you're going through." And Sarah was saying I wish it had taken me 2 months, because when you're at 2 months, you are still kind of in this okay, it's taking a little bit longer, but God, you have a plan. And so that's kind of how the prayer starts. It starts with this idea of Lord, could you give us this? And then each month that goes by, or each loss, your prayers just get a little bit shorter and shorter and shorter. And that's wrong, and it's flawed thinking, but that's kind of the path that I went to. And so this is also where I would say it's really important to build habits outside of a crisis or a loss. So if you're not, if you are, it's never too late. But if you're not going through something really hard, it's this lesson that I started to learn that talks about the idea of walking it back. And so when I don't feel like praying, or I don't feel like opening the Bible, or I'm angry, you walk it back, and I got to start with the gospel, right? So I got to start with the gospel, and I got to speak that truth to myself, even when I don't feel it. So I have to remind myself, God is good. How do you know that God is good? And keep walking it back. Has he been faithful to you in other areas of your life? Okay, what are those areas of those life? What did that faithfulness look like? Did you see it in the moment? And start to release the control, so that then, you can start to be like, okay, God, I can trust you with this really hard, big thing, because I've walked it back and I remember the past. And so that's kind of how my prayer life evolved, from being oh yeah, I'm going to pray about it all the time, I'm never going to pray about it, to saying, okay, I need to talk to you about it, but let me walk it back and start fresh.
That's really good. That's really good advice. Now, with loss and infertility, you, of course, felt that deeply, but you weren't the only one in this scenario that was feeling that. So how did your relationship with your spouse and partner evolve through the struggles of infertility and miscarriage?
Yeah. I think this is another hard one.
This is a hard one.
Yeah. the enemy wants nothing more than to drive a wedge between you and your spouse, and he'll use anything that he can to take your eyes off of the way marriage is supposed to look. I actually, when I was kind of preparing that we were going to talk about this, I read a statistic that said couples who experience a season of infertility or a pregnancy loss are 3 times more likely to call it quits. It's like, wow, the odds are like not in your favor. And so you have to be battling that, even though I would say the journey for me was very different than the journey for my husband, who also struggled with it, but struggled way differently. You know, he wasn't the one that had the loss or was bleeding or was doing this. And so it's just from totally different vantage points. And so I would say, and again, this isn't specifically for infertility or loss, but I would say you need to talk about it / don't talk about it. Got it?
Yeah.
Clear?
Yeah. Tell us more.
It's like you need to talk about it. You need to, even when you don't want to, say how you're feeling, even when you can't really articulate it. But also, it can't be all you talk about. Otherwise, it becomes all-consuming to your relationship, and your identity as a couple becomes wrapped up in this. And that feels like it naturally happens because you're like, this is the hardest thing that we're going through. And so trying to find that balance of like, we're going to go to dinner and we're going to talk about it on Friday, and then on Saturday, we're just going to be a couple and we're not going to talk about it. I mean, it doesn't have to be that rigid, but creating space for both of those. I would say that you got to search for joy where you can find it. So it might be an extra date night, a weekend away, cake for breakfast. I don't know. That brings me joy. You know, that probably doesn't bring you joy.
No, it brings me joy.
But yeah, seek ways. Be intentional about seeking ways as a couple that are fun, that can fill you up, that can kind of remember who you were before this trial was, like who you were as a couple. And then back to even that praying is to pray together, which can feel super awkward and uncomfortable. And I don't know, sometimes I'm like, this feels so weird. I don't know what to say. But you're praying for each other. You're praying with each other. Yeah, like I said, I had a season where I stopped praying and I was absolutely at my worst, and my marriage was probably at its worst too during that season. So you want to avoid that.
I think it's so good to even mention though, because I think that when we go through seasons, the right thing to do is to stay tethered to God. Sometimes that feels impossible, that you can't do that. But I love that you even mentioned that you had a season where you weren't praying and that didn't work out either.
No.
You know, that sometimes you think like, I feel so angry and so lost and so without hope that I'm going to try something else because right now this isn't helping. But then to hear.
Yeah, it's worse.
It's worse.
Yeah.
It's worse.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone in the faith community who wants to support a couple with infertility or miscarriage?
I feel like having people see you is the gift. And infertility and miscarriage and loss and questions, it just feels super isolating. And, you know, what I think makes it different is, so if you have cancer and you go through chemo, you lose your hair. And so people know that you are walking through cancer because there are physical signs and they can see that. That is not the case when it comes to like infertility. Like people have no idea what you're going through. And so you feel really unseen, because I actually think nowadays people talk about it more than they did when I was really walking through some of the thick of it. And so having people who just see you makes a world of a difference. And so finding ways that you can remind someone they're seen. It might be a meal, like a sweet treat. Again, it's like the sweet treats for me.
Yep.
It's the cake for me. It could be a text that just says like, hey, thinking about you. It's an awareness to know that like Mother's Day and baby showers are really hard days. And so I still feel like there's people on Mother's Day actually, oddly, is super complicated for me now, even having walked through it and the way that the Lord has crafted my family. Like Mother's Day is not a joyful day for me. It like takes me back to all the years that it was so painful. And I feel like I just feel like people's tension because it's complicated. So even just, like, hey, saying to someone like, I know this day might be complicated for you. Thinking about you, love you. You're not saying, I know it's complicated, I know how you're feeling, but you're just saying like, hey, I see you. Here's flowers like on this day to help you think about it. So just being sensitive to those spaces. The other thing I thought was like creating a space for someone to just be with you. So they might want to talk about what's going on. There are times that I might wanted to talk, but there are times that like, one of my friends would be like, do you want to catch a movie? I'm like, I do want to catch a movie and I don't want to talk about anything. I just want to laugh at this movie and eat popcorn and chocolate cake. They don't sell that at the movie theater, but they should.
They should.
But yeah, and so just having a space where you're like, if you want to talk, let's talk. If you want to just go for a walk and not talk about anything important, we can do that too.
Now, you were going through all of this in this 10 years during a time that a lot of your friends were building families and
everybody was having babies.
Yeah. How was that for you? 2, how do you support your friends when you're in such a painful place? And how do you even handle kind of the feelings of isolation that came along with that?
That's a good question. I once was really hurt. I had a friend who found out she was pregnant and she didn't want to tell me. And so I was like the last one to know. And she was like so afraid to tell me. And it like crushed me because I was like, oh my gosh, do you think that that I can't rejoice with you? Now that's not to say that it still didn't sting because it did. Like it still hurt every time someone popped up pregnant. You're like, well, good for you, But I think that you can feel both things. And so you can both be joyful for a friend or a family member who is experiencing something really good and grieve what you don't have. And it doesn't mean that the right emotion is always going to come out on top. But I think giving it space and having friends who recognize that space and give you space. So for me, if I was going to have a friend do a pregnancy announcement in a really fun way in a group of people, I would love to know ahead of time. Then I can choose if I want to come or if I don't want to come. And I don't have to ruin the surprise, but just like being caught off guard with something could be really triggering. And so just being like, hey, I'm pregnant. I'm going to tell everybody tonight through this game that we're going to play, just so you know. And then I get to choose whether I want to be a part of it or not, instead of you choosing for me. So that's one thing. The biggest thing that I would say is to not isolate. I think isolation is so dangerous. I think it's the enemy's biggest tool. When there is no truth going in, I don't know how you ever get right side up again, because just false things can take root and seeds can grow. And so I know it's hard because you don't want to go out and you don't want to hang out with people and you feel crummy. But at least find one person that you can be honest with and say like, I feel crummy. This is crummy. I'm not having a good day. I would also say go to church. Like, it's hard, but corporate worship and prayer and the reading of God's word will not return void. And so building that habit to every week, make sure that you are in church and you've got one person that you can check in and be honest with. The rest of the people, you can be fake with them. Doesn't matter. You need one person who's going to speak truth to you and love you through that.
Yeah. Because I think, you already mentioned this, but I think one of the things about infertility too is I don't mean that it's such a secret, but it's something that people start trying to have babies in privacy. And at what point do you start to let people in on the journey, and trying to find that time, because it would be so easy to just isolate even more. How have you experienced God's presence or guidance in unexpected ways throughout your journey with infertility and loss?
Yeah, let's see if I can take it all and, sum it up. It's like infertility has been years of heartbreak for me, and it comes in different waves. So I might have a season where I'm feeling like really confident, and then there might be a day when I'm like, oh man, I'm right back kind of where I started. But I also feel like my heart has changed more in the last 15 years than I ever thought it could. There is something so cool that God would be willing to meet me in the middle of my mess. And so it's like I didn't have to work through those questions and doubts and accusations that I was making against him for him to be willing to come into it with me. And so he will hold me accountable to some of that flawed thinking when those thoughts start to creep back in. And, his reminders that like, I am seen, like I am loved. God has goodness for me, even if it's different than I could comprehend on this side of heaven. But the biggest thing I feel like that I would want to say or want to make sure that people hear is like, there is no shame in saying that your heart and head are broken and that they don't match. I feel like that's the only space where you can really know him as healer. And it's not necessarily healer of like my womb. It's like healer of my eyes, like to be able to see him like for who he really is. I think there's nothing more authentic or beautiful than a woman who learns to let God rebuild her life day after day, no matter how many broken pieces there are to pick up, no matter how much work you did the day before. If you come back and you're like, it's all broken again the next day. I think that is like where real, authentic, beautiful faith lie. And it's like in that journey, I feel like God has shown me the most beautiful pieces of himself, and to say that he is truly trustworthy, even with those crevices like of my heart that I like have kept hidden away from him.
Mm-hmm. That was such a beautiful answer, and I think something that can be so applicable in so many different places of brokenness. If you were to leave our listeners with anything, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I feel like whatever kind of heartbreak you're going through, if it's infertility, a miscarriage, secondary infertility, which in and of itself is so complicated because the world is saying like, you should be satisfied with what you have, but your heart is still longing for more. Like wherever that is, it's like just the fact that like God can handle it. He is not thwarted by how broken you feel. If you will just like lay the pieces before him and trust him to rebuild it, like he is trustworthy and good and faithful to do that.
Mm-hmm. Holly, thank you so much for sharing your heart, sharing this really, really hard side of it too. I appreciate it. I appreciate learning about you and your journey and how you went through all of it to get to the other side. I also want to say for listeners, especially during this time, if you are struggling and feeling like you are broken and at a loss, you are not alone. And you will never be alone. And you have people that are there that have been in similar places and that are in your corner to cheer you on. Thank you for listening to this episode. This has been Parenting for the Everyday. Tune in next time.